Kuchiyara, north of Tripura, or should we take them along the Purna, or is there a different route? I think we need to see that this contrast is there, and that we need to read these sets of reports in relation to each other, though we may get a partial understanding of the region, which has come under international control, has it back to the consequences of this in the wild. I think you are very aware of the irregular conditions, so I don't need to more than point them out. The world was and is still conditioned by a monsoon climate. This means that we have a situation which is flexible, it's changing, it's fluid in a very little sense, and livelihoods at this point in time were adjusted to such conditions. Much of the cultivated lands are inundated for several months of the year, and during rains, the rivers will carry large amounts of silt, which continuously reshape the riverbed. They fill up lakes, they make marshes, and again they are removed by the next flood, and you can see how the landscape doesn't stay in place. It's constantly changing. Much of the land was then covered by forest. This is clear from the maps, but also from the report. And both from describing the forest as such, but also the surveyors who are reporting back on the how to move the troops, they will say, well, in this place, not even two men can walk side by side, so they have to be elephants and so on. It's a reflection of the forest. So people depend on the cultivation of the soil, but not only, and sometimes not primarily, but rather fishing, hunting, and trade. And the sources of livelihood were flexible also across the different species. Now, in the 18th century report, take James Rennan, for example. He observed this water and he appreciated it. He noted that East Bengal was, and he writes like this, naturally the most convenient for trade within itself of any country in the world, for its rivers divided into just a number of branches, but the people have the convenience of water carriage to and from every principal place. So this is a landscape, according to Rennan, defined by water, and it's suitable for commerce. Now, half a century later, the East India Company revenue survey officers were more interested in land than in water. And they were there to find this cultivated land and to measure it. Of course, they noted the water. Of course, they described the seasonal lakes in quite some detail, very interesting description of these lakes and how people lived there. But since they were on a mission to look for land, they didn't really bother about the water. You know, with this British understatement, they would say, well, it makes travel tedious. That's how they described flood. Now, these officers were ordered to report on locational routes and size and assessment of feet, and this is exactly what they did. Now, with these irregular conditions, occasionally there were disasters, large-scale devastation that hit the region. For example, a huge earthquake, 1762, hit the Arab control. It's been estimated to have measured more than 8.1 on the Richter scale. And tsunami researchers, those who really, a lot of research was triggered by the tsunami of 2003. They have sought for a historical equivalent, and the 1762 earthquake is what they come up with as the equivalent. And the descriptions, there are reports or letters actually in Persian written from Chittagong, the description of very, very, very dramatic, they're almost apocalyptic in the situation. But this is a very dramatic event. Then you have the more, let's call it the regular disasters, if I may. Because late 18th century came among Europeans in general to be known for what was called the unusual weather conditions. Now, what is the unusual weather conditions? They had new scientific methods, and this made systematic observations possible in a way that had not been possible before. And by using this data, the scholars could then produce very complex climate theories. I'll cut this short. We can come back to it if you're interested. But there was a lot of new information coming in, and I think this should also, we should have some caution about this, because with this method generating so much more information, it may give the impression of a crisis, or something which is different. But what is different is actually that you have so much information which you didn't have before. At the same time, whether it's correct or incorrect, I think we can safely conclude that it added to a general sense of crisis and anxiety. There were dramatic shifts in the climate which disturbed the company officers. On the one hand, heavy floods. On the other hand, very severe droughts. There were floods in the 1780s. In particular, in 1787 there was a flood that's really a landmark flood. There were also others, but this one changed the courses of most rivers. It created six new large rivers. And these would be the Tista, the Jamuna, the Gerangi, the Matabanga, the Kitinok, and the Mayabangi. These are huge rivers. And more importantly, the Brahmaputra changed its course in 1787 from the old route which go through the minor thing, but now has a straight southern. So this is massive amounts of water which suddenly changes route, and it took, according to reports, 3 decades for the landscape to stabilize. Because for every rain, there were new streams. You can imagine the number of more streams. And it caused, lots of people died. Along the Tista, for example, half the population was reported dead, and so on. As a contrast, you have a drought. The most well-known and often written about is 1759-70, when 1/3 of the Bengal population died. And this is one drought in a stretch of droughts, and they strike a little differently. I won't go into details, but just point to an interesting research which has come out in the last, let's say, almost 10 years, perhaps not 10, but almost. And that's the researchers who look into the situation of El Niño, this weather phenomena. El Niño researchers, it gathers historians, geologists, oceanologists, and others, who use historical documentation to make long sequences, long timelines of El Niño occurrences, and they conclude that 1789 to 95, the world was affected by what they say the strongest and most prolonged El Niño event of the millennium, 1000 to 2000. I leave it at that, but I find it interesting to see that there is some kind of correlation, but may not be causal. Now, if we just leave out the correctness of the weather observation, I think we may conclude that the Europeans experienced the first 3 decades of British rule in Bengal as ridden by extreme weathers and climatic stress. So I think this we can keep in mind as